This is the document that's worthy of scrutiny that has emerged from the plenary session that the Indian National Congress held over the weekend. And to talk to us about it is Praveen Chakravarty, the chairman of the Data Analytics Group or Center at the Congress Party. Now, a quick disclaimer before we go into this conversation. Praveen was a contributing editor at Bloomberg Quint before he picked politics as his next career move, as one might say, and so now sits on the other side of the table and is one of, I would imagine, the many authors of this document that is the economic resolution. Welcome to Bloomberg Quint.
Thank you.
Great to have you on board, Praveen. Let me start with a kind, open-ended question on what is this document supposed to communicate to voters in India? How different is the Congress's position on the economy, on economic policy, versus how the Congress has been with the economy in the past?
Thank you, Menaka. So first, let me tell you what this document is not. It's not a manifesto. Too often we get confused about what does this talk about specific policy measures about what the Congress will do if it comes to power, but that is the role of a manifesto, not the resolution. The resolution, economic resolution at the plenary was an opportunity to step back, introspect, take stock, and set out broad themes and vision for how we see the economic policy for the challenges that the country faces today should be. And that's how this should be viewed. This is, to reiterate, this is not about very specific policy issues. On that front, I think we highlighted four big challenges. The first and the foremost is the one of jobs. Jobs and unemployment. And we could discuss in detail what the reasons are and where we are for that, but certainly that's a very big challenge. The second big challenge is inequality, economic inequality. That's not unique to India, certainly. It's a global phenomenon, but something that we should absolutely take note of and cognizance of. The third is what I call the farm to non-farm transitions, which is, we keep talking about agriculture is in distress. How do we take care of hundreds of millions of workers from the agricultural sector that will be migrating to cities, looking for jobs? The transition from farm to non-farm can be extremely complex and volatile. And the fourth is the role of the state in social security, health, and education. I think we are very clear that the state has a big role to play in these sectors, which is health, education, and providing a safety net to those that are left out and need them.
Okay, fair enough. And I'm not even trying to be combative or do not intend to be combative in my questions as much as more probing and trying to understand really what you're saying that is different from what other political parties, predominantly what the BJP has had to say, and how it really amounts to any actual difference to the economy, right? Let me start with first the charitable stuff. And actually, Raghav has said this in a column that he's written yesterday, which he titled saying, "Promising Green Shoots of Policy Discontinuities in Congress's Economic Resolution." And I think there were 2 points that he wanted to very clearly make in his column, which I'd love your comment on. I think one is the fact that you've spoken about India's private sector playing a critical role in the economy, which is different from the kind of language the Congress would have used in its geriatric past, as he's called it. And the other is where you speak of creating wealth. Again, very different. We've not heard Congress governments talk about creating wealth. Do you believe that your usage of these words in the economic resolution actually suggests a marked difference in the way you view the economy, in the way you view the private sector, in the way you view wealth creation in the country?
I think it's fair to say, yes, there is certainly an acknowledgement that the private sector is critical. And I think you're right that, especially the paragraph on mounting unemployment, where it clearly states that jobs, good productive jobs in large numbers can be created by the private sector. And it is certainly an acknowledgement that the private sector is very, very critical, because if we do acknowledge that jobs is our #1 challenge, then we are also saying that good productive jobs can be created in large numbers by the private sector. So I think that's very important. But that does not mean that we are calling for dismantling the public sector, because there's an entire paragraph on the public sector that calls for a viable and efficient public sector in specific sectors and industries. So that's perhaps a change from the past. I'm saying all of this knowing fully well that I'm 1 month old in the Congress party.
Well, it's all right. We'll cut you some slack for that. But that said, I don't get what the different view is here. Because, to me at least, one of the more winning sort of campaign agendas of Narendra Modi before he became Prime Minister and the BJP was minimum government and maximum governance. And we all read into that a smaller government and therefore also necessarily a smaller public sector, not from the point of view of the delivery of health or education or things like that, but more from the point of view of why should the government be in the business of business. This document, while it may emphasize on the private sector, and gladden hearts in doing that, says nothing about diminishing the role of public sector in the areas of business that could best be left to the private sector. So whilst you, I think, have put in a sentence there which suggests that the public sector, state ownership of business in critical sectors such as defense, mass transportation, natural resources and financial services is both needed and justified, you've almost suggested that, it's a statist or a status quoist way of looking at the world of PSUs?
No, I think that's taking an extreme view. I think first, let's step back. And there are two ways about dealing with this whole private sector versus public sector. You could take the view that these are mutually exclusive to each other. Only one can exist and the other cannot. Or you could take the view that there are certain sectors where both can exist, and if the private sector is truly efficient, it will naturally outperform the public sector. I think now globally there is recognition that there are certain sectors where businesses, with its focus on maximizing shareholder value, may not be the perfect way in setting up a business structure, such as airlines, for example. Right? Airlines is very clearly one sector where the private sector does find it extremely hard globally. I'm not talking just globally, very hard to run a profitable airline sustainably. But does that mean that the state has a role? Does not have a role? These are very nuanced kind of discussions and debates. And that's precisely what I said. This is not about very specific, will you privatize Air India kind of document. It is about throwing all of these out and saying, let's discuss. We do acknowledge that the private sector is critical.
Okay, let me rephrase my question. I want to ask you, will you privatize Air India? For all you know, it might get privatized before you all have a chance to come back to power, and who knows how long that takes. But, I get the need for the public sector in, let's say, mass transportation, where financing is of, a long-term nature, etc., etc., etc. It's a public good, all of that. I'm not sure I fully still understand why the public sector needs to be in natural resources, why the public sector needs to be in, things like financial services. So my question to you is this. Does your party view a smaller public sector, especially in those businesses where the private sector has done a damned good job and is probably way ahead, financial services, banking, does your party view that as something that needs to get done over the next 5 years? In sectors where the private sector does a damn good job, as you put it, it is natural that the public sector will shrink. In terms of market share. Will it shrink through action by the government, or will it just shrink organically over the years? Yeah, but that's... Like we're seeing happen with banking. Today, private sector banking has grabbed a bigger market share, and one might argue, as Ruchir has... I'm not so sure about that. No, so one might argue, as Ruchir has, that public sector privatization has happened through malign neglect, as he puts it, right? So my point is this, bigger market share in certain areas of financing, not in large project financing. What I mean is... 3/4 of corporate lending by the public sector banks still. Right? Okay. What I mean is, would your government envisage getting out of some of these businesses altogether? See, on banking, since you bring up banking, and let me, I personally think it is very naive to categorize this entire NPA issue as one of a PSU versus a private sector bank. I think, granted, there are clearly inefficiencies in a PSU bank and the way it functions. But as I've argued in my own column that I wrote for Bloomberg Quint about a year ago, it is unclear to me that should the private sector banks indulge in corporate loans and lending as much to the scale of public sector, that their NPAs will be any different. There is no empirical evidence for that. So I think we should be very, very careful in not trivializing a lot of this. I didn't go down the NPA route. I'm just saying, I'm using banking as an example. Sure. So we shouldn't trivialize these down to private versus public, is all we're saying. Private sector is very, very important.
if your question is, should there be public sector banks, I don't think it's a yes or a no answer right now. I think it
when
has
will
to
it
evolve.
be then?
I think it has to evolve. I believe that you can't make an answer and then go into policy making. I think you should let the market evolve. Should you make conditions easier for the private sector banks to expand? Yes. Would that mean the public sector banks automatically start losing market share? Perhaps.
So is the Congress Party committed to a smaller public sector? Not in the fields of education, sanitation, health, all of those very critical public goods. I'm talking about in the business of business.
I think it's a naive question, because it doesn't start with what should the size of the public sector be or size of the state be. In fact, today there is a piece by the economist Darren Acemoglu of MIT that says, why are we fussing so much about the size of the state? It is about how the market, let's say there is an efficient public sector and consumers prefer that over the private sector. Should we then say, no, that should not be the case just because the ownership is with the public sector? I'm merely saying, let's acknowledge that this is a far more nuanced debate than just one of private versus public.
Okay, jobs, since you mentioned that as a critical component of your economic resolution and economic strategy. I get this is not a manifesto. There are no prescriptions in there on how to be able to improve the job situation or increase the number of jobs in the country. But would it be fair for me to understand that when mentioning jobs, you've mentioned certain private sector industries, and you believe that the bulk of job creation can only be done by the private sector? So this is not one of those slightly more ambitious statements of the government being able to create jobs. Is that fair?
Absolutely, Menaka, and I think the numbers are clear, right? I mean, so for example, every 10 lakhs of investment, the steel manufacturing creates, it takes 10 lakhs of investment for a steel manufacturing plant to create one job. For the same amount, the auto manufacturer creates 3 jobs. But guess what? The textiles and the apparel sector create 240 new jobs, including 80 for women with that same 10 lakhs. The leather and footwear sector creates 70 new jobs. So that's it. This is economic survey data that I'm quoting. And as you know, I'm a very ardent reader of the economic surveys. So it's very clear then where the jobs are coming from. We don't need to sit and decide where they're coming from. The market is telling us where the jobs are coming from. So then, should we have policies that foster job creation in these sectors, that acknowledging and accepting that this is what the market is telling us?
So what would those policies be?
So, for example, I'm not for a moment suggesting that we should have very sector-specific policies. But if we do acknowledge that perhaps steel manufacturing is not creating as many jobs as textiles and apparels, then there could be a whole slew of other issues that affect the textiles and the apparel sector. Certainly, policies like demonetization impact the textiles and the apparel sector far more than they do the steel manufacturing sector. So there's no wonder that we don't have jobs in this country. So it's very clear to acknowledge that first, yes, jobs will be created in the private sector. Even within the private sector, there are huge sectoral differences, and hence we have to be cognizant of that before we indulge in policy making for jobs.
But that doesn't give me any clear idea of how you hope to be able to create jobs. Yeah, I know, but it's very easy to write their jobs as the #1 priority of the country. I could have done that.
Sure.
Yeah, it would not make for an economic resolution of the country's oldest party, right? So my point is that there needs to be something more for voters to believe that you're coming to the table with new ideas, with new implementation abilities.
So there will, I can promise you that there will be a brand new manifesto that will be written and given to voters before the elections.
But in this document, or basis this document, there is no way you can throw more light on how you believe the pace of job creation in this country can be enhanced. There's no way to do that. Not right now.
Let's acknowledge that jobs is an issue. Let us not hide behind some.
But nobody is not acknowledging. The BJP government has acknowledged jobs.
Some facade research saying 70 lakh new formal jobs are being created, and we are the world's fastest job creator, formal job creator. First, the point is, let's acknowledge that there is a problem. I think that's very, very important for the government to understand.
Yeah, well, the former part of your answer is politics. That's what all political parties do. If you were in power, that's what you would have done, hidden behind some numbers that would project a better performance.
I think Mr. Chidambaram was very categorical in his speech yesterday, said, yes, we did not create as many jobs as we should have, but we did create jobs. So I think it was very categorical. I think there was very categorical admissions. Please do listen to the speeches of Mr. Chidambaram as well as the Congress president. They were very categorical in saying, yes, there were mistakes that we made, perhaps in the last 2 years of UPA2. Yes, we did not create as many jobs as we could have. So it was very clear. There was clear admission. So
okay. All right. Inequality was the other thing that you pointed out that is at the core of this economic strategy. Let me come straight out and ask you, the DNA is carrying an article today that suggests that Congress President Rahul Gandhi said on Saturday that if his party came to power in the 2019 general elections, that it would set up a national poverty alleviation fund and impose a 5% cess on the incomes of 1% richest Indians.
I don't think the Congress president said that.
Okay.
I think what they may be referring to is the agriculture resolution.
Okay.
Okay. So, and
so is there going to be a national poverty alleviation fund?
This is not a manifesto.
No, is this correct or incorrect? That's what I'm asking you. Is there any proposal to put up a national poverty alleviation fund?
I'm fairly sure the Congress president.
The resolution has no mention of it. That I can tell you.
The economic resolution certainly does not have any mention of that.
But is there any thinking in the party that that's how to go about this?
To the extent that I have been involved in discussions on the economic resolution, this has not come up. I don't know about what was discussed in the agriculture resolution. So I have to be fair and make that clear.
Okay, but this concept of imposing a 5% cess on the richest 1% Indians.
Not in the economic resolution, for sure.
Is this something that, that would be
was not even discussed.
No, that's fine. It's not here right now. But is this something that would become core to your economic strategy?
I mean, absolutely. I don't know. I think it's just so premature. Like I said, we step back.
It's not premature. Your party has had 4 years to think through what its economic policy should be.
It's premature because we don't put out policy-specific details 4 years before an election or even 1 year before an election. We do that a few months before we go to polls. So that's number one. Again, like I said, this is to step back and say, what are the problems? Let's introspect. What should we do going forward? And that's about it. This is not about what tax rate. I mean, the next question could be, what should the GST tax rate be when we come to power? And I think it's completely premature.
Mr. Chidambaram has said a lot about already. So
I think he said in Parliament that we need 18%.
He said lots about it already. So
we said we asked for an 18%. That does not mean that we know exactly what the GST tax slab will be.
Well, I think the document also refers to that comment 18%, on which we would have liked a single GST rate at 18%.
Which was public in Parliament.
Yeah.
That was said publicly in Parliament.
Correct. Yeah. So
before
I go to GST, I do want to settle this issue of inequality. Now, I'm sure that the economists, and many of them are your friends, are all wondering about the reference to Piketty and whether that's the right reference or not. And this could make for another 20 minutes of debate on how you hope to fix inequality. It's great you flagged it off. How do you hope to fix it?
See, I think, again, like I said, first, it's an acknowledgement of the problem. I personally do think it's a global problem.
Why is that new, if I may ask you? It isn't that we needed the Congress economic resolution to tell us that inequality is an issue.
We were not writing a story and storytelling. It wasn't storytelling to tell some new stories for people. It could very well be a well-known, but it is important for the party to put it in a resolution.
Okay.
So I think we have to be very clear. This is not about me. I know media thinks new and breaking all the time.
Not necessarily.
This doesn't have to be new and breaking all the time.
Okay.
Right? So if inequality was well known to everybody, it is still important for the party to acknowledge and put it out.
Okay.
If lack of jobs is well known to everybody, it was still important for the party to acknowledge.
Agreed. No disagreement on that. How do you fix it?
So there are no. Fixing is a very complex thing.
Not asking for prescriptions. Conceptual conversation is what I'm asking.
Which is what I think we flagged it. I think we said very clearly, this is a universal problem, and it's very complex. It's very, very complex, because what is happening is modern economic development paradigm favor returns to capital over returns to labor. And I know this is technical.
No, it isn't. This has been the conversation at the center of why globalization has also gone wrong, right?
No. We'll separate that. We'll separate that. Today, do policies encourage capital investment more than labor investment? Perhaps. Over the last few decades, maybe some would say half a century, that's how we've progressed, and that's yielded results, no doubt about that. But for the first time, we're realizing that maybe that also exacerbates inequality, right? So how do we tackle this? And it'll be very kind of haughty of me to sit here and say I have the answers. I mean, this is an issue that's confronting everybody. Does that mean tariffs? Does that mean protectionism? Does that mean incentivizing investments in labor? It could be all, it could be a mix of these. So that's why I think it's very, very important to kind of at least debate this before we jump into what we think are package solutions.
So it would be premature to ask you if there is already an evolving view within the party on how you hope to be able to sort of fix this imbalance, because at this point in time there is no decision on how to fix it. It's just we need to acknowledge that it's a problem. That's
the various discussions about this internally.
So are the discussions more towards, let's say, for instance, job-based incentives for industry?
Could be.
Is that the road you're taking? Are the discussions, more towards some other kind of tariff-led, protectionist-led, series of policies?
It could be. It could be all of that. I think the first thing is let's get back and revive private investment. Let's start creating jobs, and then figure out how we tackle inequality in the mix of all of this. I mean, it is very complex. So, but the idea is to put this out, flag this out. Ironically, it was Dr. Manmohan Singh who coined the term inclusive growth, and we are sitting here saying it's a problem.
Okay. One of the other things that struck me as I was reading the document is that while I get this is not a manifesto and you're not putting prescriptions out there or action points of what you intend to do in the first 100 days or 200 days, all of that, but it's also a document that doesn't necessarily give us any glimpse of whether the Congress has acknowledged some of the policy misadventures that it experienced in its previous term in government. And I'll give you some illustrations for why I think that way. At one point the document talks about, when talking about the banking problem, it says that the beginning of the banking problem was partly due to the unwarranted criticism of the telecom, coal and power policies of the UPA. And I thought that was, a little surprising, because this issue of discretionary allocation of resources needed to get settled. Your government couldn't do it, and then perforce had to do it after all the corruption charges and the court decisions came in. So that seems to be almost as if we're not acknowledging that our discretionary allocation policies, for over a decade, and for governments before that as well, were not the right way to go. The second place where I thought that there was, a little bit of living in denial was banks have been forced to write off 4 times more loans in the last 3 years than in 10 years of the UPA. These were not loans that were given out in the last 3 years that went bad in the last 3 years and therefore are the responsibility of a particular government. I mean, these were loans, as you know better than I do, because you've studied this more than I have. Loans that were given out over a period of time and have gone wrong for a variety of reasons. I'm not talking about fraud. I'm talking about just projects that became unviable, right? Not attributable to any one government, definitely not necessarily attributable to this government. So again, it seems to be living in denial of the policies of the past. I think the third bit, the Modi government has distorted the concept and use of Aadhaar, it says in one place. But the UPA government actually implemented Aadhaar without the protection of a legislation. I mean, it's only in 2016 that Aadhaar, in fact, even got a law. So my question to you is this, simply. Are you still living in denial, and by you I mean the Congress party, of your policy misadventures of the past?
So I would suggest you listen to the speech of the Congress president at the plenary, where I don't know of any other president of a political party, certainly a national party, standing up in front of 15,000 people and the entire media saying we made mistakes.
Why would you put Aadhaar in your, I mean, you know Aadhaar better than I do.
So that's number one. Okay, I'll come to it. Okay, so if you want to take Aadhaar first, I'll take Aadhaar first. Okay. See, Aadhaar, there was an Aadhaar bill that was introduced. It went to the standing committee. It was headed by Dr. Yashwant Sinha. It was rejected. Please remember, there is one fundamental difference between UPA 2 and this government. This government, as an absolute Lok Sabha majority, which I think is very, 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 very critical for policy making. There were lots of things we couldn't do. We couldn't get the Aadhaar bill passed. That was the fact. That was the truth. That was the truth.
Then should you not have held up the implementation of
Aadhaar
without legislation protecting ordinary citizens like you?
See, I think you're talking about, okay, so privacy...
I don't want to make this about Aadhaar. I'm just using these as illustrations to be very honest.
And I take your point. And in some would say maybe it's 2020 hindsight now. At that point, you're clear that there is, don't have a majority, there's no support for this, but you're very clear that there are all these benefits from a public service delivery perspective of Aadhaar. So it was a conscious choice that we made. But very clearly, it is unfair to say that there were no attempts to pass
I didn't say there were no attempts. I'm just saying.
I agree with you.
So my point, and since we agree, I won't dwell on it any further. In fact, let me add to the other point. One more point in all of this. You all have used tax terrorism several places in this document. I laughed every time I read it because that phrase was coined to describe the tax policies under, if I remember correctly, Finance Minister Pranab Mukherjee, and the infamous Vodafone case now. So it was used to describe the taxation policies of the UPA government. I found it a little rich that you've littered this document with tax terrorism to describe the impact of GST on small and medium-sized businesses.
If a phrase applies, it applies everywhere.
Okay, good answer. Okay.
On the banks and the loans. See, I mean, economy is a continuing engine, right? I mean, we can't draw a line, and if your larger point is we can't draw a line and say it was like this and this was like this, I take that point. But it's also somewhat, I think pretentious to say, oh, all these loans went bad only because it was given at that time. Let's say the economy boomed. Like my constant argument has been, it is rare to get such a near perfect alignment of stars. Low global oil prices, absolute majority in the Lok Sabha, and a robust world economy. And let's say the economy did perform as it was supposed to have, and all these projects became viable, all these businesses, all these loans suddenly became performing. Was that a possibility? So all I'm pointing out is let's not try and say it became sour because it was given in a certain period. Why aren't we acknowledging that the economy didn't clearly perform?
Okay. Look, I'm not an ardent supporter of the BJP's economic policies or lack of them thereof. I just found several of these points in the document conversation worthy because it gives us a better idea of how the party is approaching, policy making in the run-up to the main elections, and that's what all of this is about, right?
Absolutely.
And so I was a little disappointed that there was no acknowledgement that, look, we messed up. There may have been in your president's speech, but when you bring these references back in the economic resolution and blame them on somebody else,
I challenge you to point one other president of a political party in this country that can stand up and say we made a mistake.
Oh, well,
so clearly settles the debate.
Congratulations to him on that. Settles the debate there. Yeah, but then the document should reflect the record.
The president of the party says that. What are you going on and on about the document?
Because that's the economic resolution.
The president of the party says we made mistakes.
All right, okay. Fine, I think there were just one or two small other points, but I thought it was interesting the way you worded some stuff. Banking sector in deep crisis due to the undermining of institutional integrity of regulatory institutions. I think the reference there is fairly clear. And failure of regulatory oversight. Is there something here that you think needs to be augmented that hasn't been?
Clearly, isn't it? I mean, I think clearly everyone's acknowledged.
I want you to articulate it, so.
Clearly, everyone's acknowledged that there has been a regulatory oversight, and yeah, I mean, I think it's ownership and regulation, and a lot of these things that are mixed in the banking sector for sure.
You've just spent a few minutes defending ownership in the banking sector, so
I said they're mixed.
Okay.
Ownership and regulation.
So are you suggesting something that needs to change here specifically?
I think it's very clear. I think we must separate ownership from regulation. It doesn't matter.
But it is separate right now. Ownership lies with the government.
On paper.
Regulation lies partly with the government, partly with RBI.
That's my point. Partly with the government, partly.
So you agree with what the governor of the Reserve Bank of India, Urjit Patel, has said in his speech recently, that the RBI needs more powers when it comes to public sector banks.
I mean, there's no doubt about that.
I'm just asking you.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I think regulatory and investigative agencies have to be separate from the executive, and I think it's a very classical 101 in political science.
Okay, I think I've covered almost 80% of what I wanted to talk about. The rest, I'm sure, will sort of devolve into the politics of the time conversation. So, final word to you on really what is the message you hope voters will take away from this? Is this really a new Congress? Is this a new way of looking at the economy? One of the things I thought, and I asked economists to address this, so did you miss any big new idea? And the response I got was, well, do we necessarily need a big new idea? So let me throw that to you and ask you to wrap this up.
And see, again, like I said, it is not about new idea or old idea. It's not about stale or something chatteringly innovative. It is about, first, introspection, acknowledgement of issues, and saying that these are the challenges that we acknowledge exist, and hence our economic policy doctrine will be focused on addressing these challenges. Now, what those specific policy measures are, and you're entirely justified in being very eager to know what those policy measures would be, but at this point in time, this is not a manifesto. So it's about, and I can guarantee and assure you that there will be very clear, specific solutions that will be laid out in the manifesto. But I hope even the resolution is somewhat more detailed, somewhat more articulated with facts and data, other than some of the going back and forth of the tutu meme between the...
It's very well written, I must say. At 12 pages, it's a breeze of a read, and you can go back and read it several times onwards. So that's a great beginning. And I think all the other points that we raised right up front, the focus on the private sector, the focus on wealth creation, these are all new things to hear the Congress espouse. So
I will point this out, though. I mean, since, again, perhaps missed this. So there were a series of speeches on the economic resolution. Right? The second speaker who spoke was a senior member of the Congress party from Kerala, former minister. He stood up and said that should we indulge in self-criticism for the 1991 reforms? That is the Congress party. That is the Congress party. There are all sorts of ideas. There are people coming from all different schools and ideologies, and he actually said that publicly. So this is not a secret. It's there. He said that. And he was allowed to express his views. Clearly, finally we said, no, we're not going to indulge in self-criticism of that. But that's a point of view.
Well, Praveen, I didn't think I'd ever say this, but uniquely now that is your problem. Ours is to wait for the manifesto and see what the specifics look like. But thanks very much. They say well begun is half done, and we'll leave it up to the audience to figure out whether you have well begun or not. Thank you very much for joining us here on Bloomberg Quint, and thank you for watching.